Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. In May of 1978, electronic music legends Kraftwerk released The Robots. It's a model of the band's hypnotic rhythm and sparse lyrics. And if you listen carefully, there's an AppSec message in, "We are programmed just to do anything you want us to." Which means this week we talk with Lynn Marks from Imperva about bad bots, their behavior, and their business impact. Then in the news segment, Azure gets extra replica, Chrome diminishes document.domain, Go gets more fuzzing, Microsoft races a message bus, and more. Charge your batteries and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
SUSE.io makes security tools for everyone. SUSE's flat rate pricing means you can set up SCA and DAST tools for your whole team. No seat counts, no scan limits, and you never have to talk to a salesperson. SUSE integrates with all common CI/CD platforms and supports most popular package managers. And thanks to SUSE's open source vulnerability scanner, license management suite, and SBOM generation capability, you can get back to what you really want to be doing, coding in no time. Visit securityweekly.com/SUSE.
This is episode 195, recorded May 2nd, 2022. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
It's more fun to compute. How are you, Mike?
Grab your pocket calculator, and maybe we'll squeeze in a cover at the end of the episode. While you're grabbing that, if anybody out there has a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows, whether it's Kraftwerk or not, submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly, and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. Then join Paul Asadorian and Rich Mogul on May 4th to learn how to choose the right architecture for your application, because you don't want to be highlighted here on "we take your security seriously" when there's a breach. And so if you want to learn about the right architecture for your app, you will go listen as a live attendee, because you also have a chance to win a $100 Hacker Warehouse gift card. Register at securityweekly.com/webcasts. Plus, don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Lynn Marks is a skilled product manager with more than 10 years of experience in R&D and B2B product management. Previously, she was product manager at Model N and Distill Networks, acquired by Imperva, where she oversaw the product roadmap and innovation. At Imperva, she manages advanced bot protection, client-side protection, and works closely with customers to solve complex business challenges. Hello, Lynn. Thank you for joining us.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to skip the Voight Conf tests and make sure that you're, are you a bot or not, a replicant or not, and maybe just talk about what the bots themselves do. So we're talking about bots, and there are good bots out there. There's bad bots out there. And of course, I think we want to talk about what the bad bots are, but rather than just saying they're bad and kind of ending there, that seems rather boring. What makes bots bad? Or, why are we caring about bots in this from this perspective?
That is a great question. So, first of all, in the last year, we have noticed a trend where bad bot traffic continues to rise and become more complex. So, in the last year, out of all global traffic, we've seen that 27.7% of that traffic was actually made up of bad bots. So it's crazy to think that over 25% of all global traffic is actually made up of these bad bots, taking up bandwidth and also taking any of the products or other things that customers might actually want to do legitimately on your websites. Now, these bad bots can really have a negative impact on organizations across industries. So, of course, they can impact your revenue and your bottom line. They can also end up impacting your customer satisfaction, which can end up leading to customer churn. And as you can imagine, if you have a lot of bots hitting your infrastructure, you can also end up having performance issues, downtime, and also increased infrastructure costs. So bad bots, which are really becoming so much more prevalent and are hitting almost every different type of organization can really end up having an impact on not only the security teams, but also every other department across organizations as well.
So there's some things I'd love to pick apart there, because you touched on a couple aspects that I think engineers will immediately respond to. They're taking up bandwidth, taking up hitting latency, causing performance impacts right there. Things that SREs are going to be paying attention to. But we're not actually getting into, I don't think we need to get into the aspect of just a pure distributed denial of service from a bot. There's things that are more interesting at the application layer that you started to touch on a little bit. I'd love to hear more about, in the sense of what they're doing in terms of that non-legitimate traffic, or they're basically abusing workflows that are intended for humans. They're just doing it at a higher rate, perhaps. Things like fraud or interesting ways that they're targeting resources. So rather than just, if we imagine, I'm a ticket master or that type of company that wants to prevent scalpers from getting, all the Kraftwerk concert tickets that are coming out over the summer. There's a lot of other types of scenarios that these bots can impact on the business logic or business workflows, if you will. What are some of those that you've seen over the past year or so?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And that's really what makes bad bots so hard to catch. It's because they are actually using your applications or your websites or APIs as you actually intended legitimate users to do it, but they're trying to do something nefarious on there. So in the last year, what we've seen is the top attack is account takeover. So that means that they're either testing the validity of a lot of different credentials, or they're actually taking over specific accounts and are able to do other nefarious or fraudulent activities on those accounts that they've taken over. The other two types of most common attacks that we've seen are content or price scraping, as well as scalping, or another name you might have heard for it is inventory hoarding. And these are consistently the top three types of bot attacks that we're seeing hitting applications. And it really is hitting any application or website where you can think of where they could have a login page, where they might have interesting information, whether it's about their customers or about the products that they actually provide, or for any e-commerce site. If you have products that bots and their operators can resell, then that makes you a target for these top three types of bot attacks.
Yeah, I think there's also that aspect of just outright fraud, I'm going to guess, too, in the sense of trying to make money off of compromised credit cards. So how do we, you touched on that a little bit, saying here's inventory that as the attacker, then we can resell. One of the best ways to resell stolen credit cards is through gift cards, for example. And so that's just another endpoint that attackers can go after in broad, at high volume is the word I'm going for there, just to resell these cards. So we've got a lot of interesting things beyond just the account takeover. When there's also the aspect then, of course, we understand what the problem is. We want to defend ourselves. The classic defense probably that everyone in the world has seen are the CAPTCHAs. So as you're talking with customers and they're either, they're worrying about the impact of bots, they're trying to figure out how to counter them, how much and how often are they still talking about the user experience and trying to be friendly to us humans that are hitting those applications and trying to avoid just something as simple as CAPTCHAs? And maybe the other way of asking that more succinctly is, can we ever get rid of CAPTCHAs because they're just such a pain, right?
Yeah, so a comfortable and frictionless user experience is definitely one of the top two things that we consistently hear from customers. The first thing, of course, is they want a solution that can provide them with good efficacy and can actually bring visibility and mitigate these bad bots. But then, of course, they don't want to take that at the expense of having their actual users having a bad experience. So it's definitely still a top concern for our customers. Now, many of our customers still believe that CAPTCHA is a mitigation that they will still need to keep on using, because they might have other stakeholders within the organization that maybe don't want the additional risk, let's say, of false positives, and don't want to outright block customers. So let's say for our products, where we assign like a risk level for each different type of request that we see, let's say for high confidence requests that we see, a lot of our customers, I think 91% of our customers, they said block for that. With, some other ones are setting CAPTCHA. And then for the medium risk or medium confidence logins, that's usually where we'll see them still setting something like a CAPTCHA. So they do believe that blocking outright is the best way to go when you have high confidence, but when it is a page or an application where it could be more sensitive or can really impact the user experience and what they're able to do on it, they sometimes might want to continue using CAPTCHA for those login attempts or requests where we're not entirely sure if it is a bot or not. And they just want that extra vote of confidence that a CAPTCHA is able to bring.
Sure. And you're mentioning there too about the different sensitivity of the type of pages, call them just resources, API endpoints, what have you, that an attacker might target. Curious, how much monitoring have you seen application owners put into their apps, put into their products to actually identify when bots are happening? Because I can guess that on the aspect of account takeovers, everybody, especially security orgs, security teams, are going to be thinking of, we want to make sure we have strong controls on our login page because that's the obvious sensitive spot. But when you start to get into other parts of the application, it might not be self-evident, or maybe the security org isn't the one that's necessarily has the monitoring to identify this bot behavior. So maybe give us some insights or some advice on, or maybe just some stories, if you will, about when do orgs discover that they're actually being attacked by these bots, or there's bad bot behavior being used against their site.
Yeah. So like you mentioned, there's a lot of really sensitive pages or paths that are important to have additional monitoring on. And I think that you bring up a really important point, because it's really having that visibility or monitoring in place that allows you to understand what is your baseline. And if that baseline starts to change, maybe there's something weird going on with bots or fraud being conducted. So we've definitely seen that a majority of security practitioners have some monitoring or visibility into the general traffic for the more sensitive sites. So like the login page or the credit card page or maybe the gift card page. But we've definitely also seen examples where there are other metrics that can be indicative of bad bots hitting the applications or fraud occurring on the applications that aren't actually being monitored by the fraud team, by the security team, but are being monitored by other teams like the fraud team or the marketing team or e-commerce teams. An example of this is a beauty e-commerce website. And this website was being hit by carding attacks, where the bots were trying to validate if credit cards that they found online were actually valid. And the way that they do this is that they make a lot of small purchases on the website with each of the credit cards. And then, of course, for the ones that are valid, they can buy bigger purchases with them. And what's really interesting about this case is that it wasn't actually the security team that realized that these attacks and fraud were occurring on the site, but it was the finance team that came to the security team when they realized that they were having a big increase in their chargeback fees. So if customers say, hey, this was a fraudulent charge, the credit card provider goes to the website where this charge was made, and they have a chargeback fee on that website. So it was that metric of, how much chargeback fees is the customer actually seeing that led to this organization realizing that they were having bots hitting their carding path.
Nice. And I like that example because it definitely highlights the aspect that these bot attacks don't have to be volumetric in the sense of the big old DDoS that you need to drop, a CDN or one of those, kind of countermeasures in there where it's just how many packets can we stuff through. It can be, in this case, maybe low and slow because that rhymes, or at least slow enough not to look like necessarily quote unquote bad traffic until the chargeback starts to hit. So is that, are there other aspects of the bot themselves, the behaviors that they use to obscure their own behavior, meaning this low and slow aspect, or the idea that I think we can in this century, in this decade, we could definitely get beyond just looking at a single IP address, because it's easy to change with cloud service providers, malware that takes over home networks, things like that. So what are some of these behaviors that bots take advantage of that are making it harder for end users just to distinguish between human versus script?
Definitely. So, I mean, you touched upon like one example that's often said, where it's these more evasive and advanced bots are, let's say, cycling through IPs. And as they're cycling through them, if they're really trying to evade detection, they might only do 1, 2, 3 requests with HIP before switching to the next one. So, if you are trying to use just simple rules to block IPs when you're seeing these bots, that's going to be like a long whack-a-mole game for you. We've seen a lot of other techniques that bots are using. Let's say they're mimicking user agents that they know customers might, like real customers might use. We've actually seen that the Safari mobile user agent is being more commonly seen because in the last year or two, Apple has released a lot more privacy functionality. And because of this more push towards privacy, it has allowed bots to take advantage of that. And by hiding behind the mobile Safari user agent, they're able to not have to give up as much of their information because of these privacy pushes that Apple has made.
Yeah, that's that unfortunate tension between minimizing universal tracking and persistent tracking, and then bots taking advantage of that. So that's always I think we're still pro-privacy here, and then the idea to try to target those bots and defeat them in different manners. I'm curious is maybe we could start shifting to that aspect of just how do we deal with the bots. So we talked briefly about CAPTCHAs, but as developers are building their applications, what are some of the things that they can keep in mind? And we touched a little bit already just on the idea of just monitoring at the application layer, or monitoring for things that are impactful, like chargebacks, where does the money go? But I'm curious if there are others, or what sort of area do you see developers try to do to harden their own systems?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the most important things you should do first and foremost is getting visibility, like you just said. And you really have to have a good catalog of all the different assets that you need to protect from bad bots and other malicious actors. And you also have to have a good understanding, not only what those assets are, but what is their typical behavior. So let's say, what is their typical rate per second of usage, or what is the typical geography of the users that are accessing that application or website? Because you really need to know, what does typical behavior look like in order for you to understand, hey, is this trend being thrown off? So I think that is a very important first step for developers to make. I think a second thing, obviously you're probably going to predict I'm going to say this. If you do see that you're being impacted by bad bots or unexpected spikes in your critical pages, it would probably be good for you to implement a dedicated bot solution. Because what ends up happening is if you are trying to solve these more persistent and advanced attacks by yourself, you often end up spending more time and money trying to develop a solution yourself, or trying to whack-a-mole block these bots, while having a dedicated solution can do that for you. Now, I can give also a couple of recommendations that are a little more on the technical side. So, one thing that is really important, make sure that you implement an audit trail, both for your infrastructure and for your application and APIs. So this will help you understand, who exactly is accessing it, where are they accessing it from, and if you are seeing weird behaviors all of a sudden, then that is a great way for you to use the audit trail. I think it's also really important for developers to understand what kind of compliance frameworks their industry or their organization needs to adhere to, and make sure that they have a really good understanding of what kind of recommendations those compliance frameworks give them, and really follow them as much as they can. So, an example is if you are an organization that is processing credit cards, it would be really important for you to have a good understanding of, let's say, what recommendations the PCI framework provides, and being able to add and implement their suggestions as much as possible. I guess the last one is related to network security. So make sure that you're only giving access to your assets to only the IPs or geographies that really need to have access to your assets. And don't just use like a blanket statement for each one of these different assets that you do have and need to protect. Make sure that you do a careful analysis of exactly who and from when and how often it should be accessed, and make sure to limit the access to anyone who does not fall in those parameters.
So then, I'm sort of curious. So I think it's interesting how we're sort of walking backwards, but walking into it's like, okay, a developer can do so much by themselves. And then, as you were saying, they have to get involved with both the compliance team as well as your risk management team and things like that. From your point of view with the customers you're working with, large and small, at what point does it make sense for them to say, okay, we've done enough of this trying to play whack-a-mole ourselves, and actually let's go and talk to Imperva or someone else out there and actually find a managed solution for this? Is that more of a is it based off of I'm guessing it's some sort of combination of both the value of whatever the properties are trying to protect, but does it come down to, is it just purely like a revenue number, or is it off of amount of traffic, or when do you think people should start thinking about sort of as a maturity model of bot management? How about that?
I think, like you said, it has to do with what kind of assets you're trying to protect, and like how much incentive do the bot operators have to continue hitting your site. So let's say if you're a fairly small site, maybe don't get a lot of traffic, don't have a lot of credit card purchases going through it, and like if you see maybe like one random attack, like maybe it's not going to be your biggest concern yet to actually go and implement a dedicated solution. But if you are an organization where, let's say, you do have a decent amount of revenue that could be getting hit, or if you have data that could be considered very sensitive, like someone in the healthcare industry where they have really important like healthcare data, which could be compliant under HIPAA, and making sure that those don't get exposed. I think those definitely will push an organization more to want to implement a more secure bot solution. And I think it also has to do with how persistent of an attack it is, and how much like resources, both from a monetary perspective and from a personnel perspective, you actually have to spend to try to mitigate that solution. So like I mentioned earlier, if you do see a lot of bot attacks, you could actually end up having performance issue, or you could have infrastructure costs. So if those infrastructure costs start really bringing your bottom line down, that could be a good business decision for the organization to want to have a dedicated solution, where even though the solution, of course, is going to cost money, it could actually end up saving you money in the long run by maybe not having to spend additional money on infrastructure. Or if you are seeing a lot of, let's say, attacks where you're then having to deal with credit cards being stolen or fraudulent purchases being made on your application, you might have additional support costs, or your support costs, or your NOC team, or even the team that is responsible for customer relations might end up having additional work and time being spent on this. So you really have to look at all of the different costs that can add up from not having bot attacks, and looking at the bottom line for how much those costs can end up eroding the bottom line. And when that cost is large enough, or if you believe that cost will get large enough, that's really when it's time for you to have a bot solution in place.
Because what's interesting is the sort of, as you've been talking, is this isn't, even if, grab, I'm guessing the most expensive version of your product, but feel free to correct me. It's not a silver bullet, right? It's still, you can't just drop it and go, we're done. There's still, like you mentioned, you have to get, in some cases, at least a capture solution as well. Or so it's still, it's going to require focus and intention, and not just like, you mentioned, I think you mentioned PCI, where for a lot of us, if you want to get around code reviews and that type of thing in PCI, I'd be like, throw a WAF in the front and you're done. But this is still, that's just one part of it, and there's still more work to be done for you or for a customer.
Yeah, definitely. I think, what's important to remember is that bot solutions are going to definitely bring visibility to all or the majority of bots, and they're going to help you mitigate. But it really is also up to your organization as you are configuring and actually managing these solutions to make sure that you are configuring the solutions in a way that the solution understands what are the important assets for your organization, so that the solution can best protect it. Whether you're creating path-specific rules, you might want to be more strict on your login page than another page, because that might be the first place where attackers can hit you. And that could, mean you might want to have additional detections on there, or you might want to implement more strict mitigation options. So I think bot solutions are, really the best way to deal with bots. And they're going to bring you a lot of ways to make that easier for you to protect them. But there is still some configuration that is involved from your team in order to make sure that they can really best bring you the value and best protect your unique use case.
Yeah. What I hear from that too, as you and John are discussing that, is that there's perhaps a call to responsibility or a good call to action for the AppSec team to do some threat modeling that focuses on business workflows, or that's threat modeling that's oriented towards what are these sensitive workflows, as opposed to threat modeling that's just walking through the OWASP top 10. Where can we maybe have, are we going to have SQL injection? Are we going to have cross-site scripting? Because I think focusing on the OWASP top 10 doesn't get you into those insights that you were saying near the end there, Lynn, about what's the context of your app. And even if you don't have something that's directly e-commerce, you might still have an app that has some constrained resources like appointments, right? And if somebody, if a bot goes out and pulls out all the appointments, and so that your legitimate customers can't get them, you now have a customer support issue, a customer happiness issue that that's one of those things that you touched on as well. So that I think that's where my mind is going, in the sense of how do we also look at these applications so we have better insights into what they're doing rather than just purely how they're coded. And I'm not sure there's a question hidden in there. I was trying to turn it around to a question, but maybe I'll try to pull a question out of there for you, Lynn, in the sense of just what are some different ways you've seen perhaps just organizations be surprised that they didn't realize that they were going to have a bot problem? Maybe that kind of touches on that they forgot to do some of that context-specific threat modeling or something like that.
Yeah. I think one interesting use case that we saw was a higher education site based in the US. So this was a university where it was a community college. So their end users were able to enroll and apply to this college. And because it is a community college, there isn't as much restrictions for who can actually apply. And what they ended up seeing is fraud and abuse was occurring on their site, because when a person in the US registers for a university, they usually get a .edu email address. And many organizations give discounts or free products to consumers with a .edu email address because they believe that maybe students have less money, or they want to be able to get them more familiar with the brand when they are younger. So what this organization was seeing is that they were actually having a really high amount of fake accounts being created on their website, because it allowed these scammers to then be able to get discounts and other free products because they had these accounts. And for this specific for this specific use case, we actually saw just in 3 days, we saw 500,000 bots hitting their account creation page. So really a crazy amount of bots hitting them. And it not only caused a lot of issues, from the fraud side, but they also ended up having skewed analytics and increased marketing costs. And they didn't really have a good understanding of how many students they should actually expect in the next school year. So, this is an example where, it might not be as obvious at the beginning to think of it, but when you realize at what kind of, valuable products or, value you can get by creating an account from this service, it really shows that, bots and their operators will really think of any way that they can abuse websites and applications, and they will take advantage of them.
Yeah, that's fun, clever thinking is sort of the second order effect of just having not direct fraud against that service, against a community college, but then reusing that against others. And it sounds like, you mentioned marketing budget, mentioned before, chargebacks. So I suppose the other call to action for AppSec security teams out there is to pay attention to budgets and see how they're getting skewed, how they're going off. Because I'm going to imagine too, just as a quick callback to that, the latency and performance aspect, the idea of clouds are elastic. They can grow to handle all kinds of spikes in traffic. But if you're spinning up more EC2 instances, spinning up more Lambdas to deal with, 500,000 accounts that are trying to sign up, you're also just spending money on a lot of cloud computing that you probably didn't need to do.
Definitely. I think it's also really important for developers. You mentioned the OWASP top 10. I don't know if you all know, but there's actually an OWASP top automated attacks. So they have a list of 21 automated attacks, which list out all the different ways that bots can impact your website and application. And I think familiarizing yourself with these different vulnerabilities is a really good way to help you catalyze all the different assets and how each one of your assets could be vulnerable to bots as well.
I think that's the second time so far this year that I've been surprised by how busy OWASP is and a new list that it wasn't on my mind. So thank you for that. I'm going to have to go peek at that. Lynn, any final parting thoughts from you is either about good bots or bad bots to send us off with?
Yeah, I think what's really important to remember is that as more and more organizations are bringing more assets online and providing more experiences that their end users can do online, bad bot traffic and more sophisticated bad bots are going to continue to rise. And really no industry is immune from this. So I think it's really important for every organization to have a look at what kind of assets they have, how vulnerable they can be to these bad bot attacks. And of course, if you are interested in learning more about solutions and how your organization can be impacted by a good bad bot management solution, you can go to imperva.com, where we have a lot more information and case studies, and we'll give you more information about the solutions that we offer.
Perfect. Thanks very much for joining us, Lynn. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Also want to thank John for joining us this session, as always, and everybody who's hanging out. As mentioned, to learn more about Imperva, visit securityweekly.com/Imperva, because these bots don't feel pity, remorse, or fear. But we feel like we need to take a quick break and return with news of the week.
Imperva protects applications wherever they live and at the pace of development. From securing applications at runtime to protecting APIs in any cloud environment, only Imperva offers a unified solution across edge, application, and data to help you achieve more and save money. Start a free trial today and quickly protect your web applications at securityweekly.com/Imperva.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Lynn Marks from Imperva about bad bots and how to deal with them. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here still with John Kinsella, and it's just about time for the news. But first, save $100 on your RSA Conference 2022 full conference pass. RSA will be live in San Francisco June 6th through 9th. Security Weekly will be there in full force, delivering real-time live coverage and interviewing some of the event's top speakers and sponsors. Register with our discount code by visiting securityweekly.com/RSAC2022 and using the code 52UCyber. See you there. And finally, don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to get all of our podcast feeds and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone. You can also join our mailing list, chat with us on our Discord server right now, and follow us on our social media and our streaming platforms. And with those announcements out of the way, as usual, Mr. Kinsella, we have a lot of news to go through. Now, I don't quite have a theme, but I think we can pull one together. But one theme we are going to start off with is Wiz.io. The folks over there have been pretty busy. And I know you've been, I think it's safe to say, fans of their work, picking apart Azure as well as some of the other cloud providers. This one is finding a cross-account database vulnerability in Azure, specifically how Azure rolled out their version of Postgres, the managed version, if you will. And it was pretty interesting read through because it talks about the attacker mindset is part of it. In terms of just Wiz.io reasoning through, they have a goal in mind. We want to try to get cross-tenant attacks. So they ask themselves, how might we do this? And the reason I'm highlighting that is just that's one of those universal aspects that generalizes into threat models. And for any AppSec team can think about what they're looking at to think, what's our goal? And then how might we get there? And the other thing that I do have to talk about really quick is that one of the neat aspects of this is that they took advantage of regular expressions. And regular expressions notoriously, they fall apart when they're used as security controls because they aren't anchored, meaning they're not matching at the beginning all the way to the end of an input text, an input string. In this case, they were anchored. So they had the little caret at the beginning, little $sign at the end. So that's the good aspect. But then unfortunately, the developers went and completely destroyed the end anchoring by just throwing a $* right at the very end, which says match anything. So rather than tying this, service-to-service authentication or identity verification to the common name within a certificate, looking at something like, this is your replication database with this identifier .azure.database.azure.com. It could continue on to be .azure.com. In this case, .wizresearch.com. And because the regex says, it looks like this common name in your certificate actually contains the host name that we were looking for, it will allow you to access it, even though the host name is actually just a subset of that pure FQDN that the researchers created themselves. So quite a clever and honestly simple use of bypassing identity and one of those oops mistakes in regular expressions. So that was my favorite part of this. I'm not sure if you've got a favorite part that might be a little bit different there, Mr. Kinsella.
I've got two of them. One, if you think about the, do I want to call it psychology? I'll say confidence. Near the beginning when they're, you hit upon it too, but when they're talking about how they decided to go and find this target and, after their previous research they worked on, actually, this, I don't know. I don't think an internal security team would go to this much trouble, but talk about a focused sort of, they're really coming up with like hypothesis they want to go after. So like they wanted a managed cloud provider that had some sort of dedicated virtual machine. They wanted some sort of service where they could execute code with the standard functionality, then hope to be able to escalate. And then they wanted the nature of the service to be high value. So that's and this off that three, that's where they decided to start looking at databases. But that's sort of a fairly sophisticated thing to do. To say, hey, we're not just going to, I think a lot of, at least from my experience, a lot of threat teams out there, our research teams out there, just sort of, let's go and who have we not picked on for? Let's go look at them, right? And this is quite targeted, which I thought was interesting. But also the fact that they're describing how they came up with that target, to me, has a ring of confidence to it, right? That they're willing to say that out loud, that like, this is how we decided to find this. And that's a sign of a pretty mature research team, which I thought was pretty cool. Overall interesting. I mean, we saw something with Postgres in Amazon. I think we talked about last week in a show, or maybe a week before. So that was based off of a driver plugin. This is more core to how, as you said, how authentication was being used here. I thought it was interesting. It was 2 points on towards the end. They got $40,000 of a payout on this from the fine folks in Redmond. And then it sounds like this was ready to disclose 2 months ago. So why have they been sitting on it? I'm not sure if they're getting ready for conference season, or maybe that there's a little more to that disclosure path than what was shown in there, the timeline. But yeah, I mean, it's another good writer from the guys at Wiz. I think, as you said, the regex is sort of the that's the thing for our listeners to think about. Like, how would you take that regex, which is there because you can see it on the page, and how would you craft that to, or how would you modify that, or the code that's using that to, not just react the way it did? Would you want to maybe not just, because I'm guessing what they had is I'm guessing they've got a URL and they're just trying to pull the host name out of it. So if they had just put a slash after that, would that have worked, or what something could have been done there to make that more anchored, to use the phrase. But yeah, good write up for folks to think about and head scratching what happened over there, and how can we make sure we don't do the same thing.
Indeed. And I think another thing, just on that topic of regular expressions, the other common way that they fail is dealing with input or mistaking input from being single line versus a multi-line match. So that's one of those other gotchas that can come up. So if you've got any regular expressions that are doing any type of controlling a security boundary, security control, make sure you've got some robust test cases around it. And there's sort of a partner. Oh, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is, as we were talking, again, I think it was last week, these blend together for me in a good way. But we were talking recently about it would be neat to see a library of tests that someone could download and run against your code. We were looking at it with, was that the database one? No, it was something else.
That was one of the crypto one, Witchproof, yes.
Yeah. But it'd be interesting in this case to see, maybe someone could have a collection of strings which you can download and unit test through your regexes. If you're trying to match a host name, it's a pretty standard thing, right? Okay, well, as you said, we got the example from here. We've got the multi-line one, like you said. These are type of things which they're I'll say known to us with air quotes for those in audio, from the point of view of we can, if you get a few of us and leave us in a room long enough, we'll think up a good collection of these, or we might have some already. But hell, throw that into an open source project and allow people to be able to get that list and actually test their applications with it. That could be sort of neat.
Would be. And speaking of testing too, there is one or two sentences in here about this PostgreSQL privilege escalation. And the researchers do mention that Azure had modified Postgres to, as they were describing, likely to introduce and harden the privilege model, possibly based on this, certificate validation, certificate identification between services. And it's not necessarily specific to Microsoft. So they don't say that they have identified this specifically in any of the other cloud service providers, but they were holding that part back too, in terms of the details on that particular part of the vulnerability, the exploit. So maybe we're going to see something more there. And that ties in a little bit, I think, to something we've talked before, also from the Wiz crowd, about what is a CVE-like system for cloud bugs. In this case, there was no action that users needed to do other than just be aware that if this vulnerability had existed. But there are things like the metadata service, IMDS v1 versus v2, which everybody should be using. It'd be good to have a CVE associated with that for AWS land so that people know this is a common misconfiguration here, or here's a common weakness in here that can be more easily exploited via SSRF. So I don't know exactly what that CVE-like system would look like or how different it would be, because in my mind, where is the call to action between what does a user need to do and respond to it versus here's just another list of CVEs to keep track of that vendors could say, yep, we check for the cloud CVEs. But that becomes just a lot of noise, perhaps. So, not sure where that can go.
So I had this thought over the weekend, and I have no idea what the hell I was working, but I don't know what I was working on that made me think of this. And I was going to turn into a Twitter thread, but I haven't yet. So hey, we'll put it here first and see what our listeners think. The idea of could you use Twitter as a sort of a vulnerability mesh or a vulnerability sort of not quite a neural network, but similar to a neural network from the point of view of, and this comes back to what we're talking about here with the cloud thing, but basically you've got a large collection of Twitter accounts that represent all these things which we could consume. So it could be NPM modules or languages or databases or cloud providers. And basically, they both have interconnections to each other, as well as me as a developer. I can actually go and subscribe to the ones I want. And then at some point, if say there's a vulnerability in Postgres or OpenSSL or one of those type of things, both it would ping, but then also the consumers of that would ping, and then I'd be able to see that ping as it would come to me. I don't know if there's something there or not, but it was a random thought that triggered sometime in my head this weekend. Yeah, so you've got a story coming up here. I don't know if you're segueing over to it, but we are now, of the cloud provider. I guess let's call it Cloud CV in general, the article from Threat Post. And yeah, so we've covered this a little bit in the past. It's actually, I don't think it's too much different than CVE, but as you said, the particular use cases which stick out in my mind is how do you either recognize if you've been affected or not, your account? How do you recognize if you need to do a mitigation yourself or not? Because it's not, like in this case, Microsoft took care of it. In a lot of cases, you can't, the cloud provider can't go and automatically fix something for you. Like if there's a default password, they can't just go and reset it because maybe you're using that for something else. They have to tell you to do that. So yeah, I know the CSA guys are still working on this. I'm sort of loosely watching it, but not too closely. It's getting traction and picking up, and that seems like something that good things will come out of it. So I believe they're working with NIST now. I'm trying to find a name I can Google. But yeah, for folks who are interested in listening on this, beside the Threat Post article, if you go and Google CSA Cloud CVE or Cloud CVE database, it'll come up. There's a repo on GitHub with some of the work around it. And I think someone was recently asking, might be someone from CNCF actually, was asking if they could set up a sandbox so people could play with it. But it's got some interest and some traction, and it's still going. So hopefully that'll mature pretty quickly. Indeed,
and we'll see. And my final thought there is just hopefully we see lists that have something informative and useful to consume from, because we have lots of OWASP lists. I learned about the OWASP top 21 automated attacks. I got to go and refresh the OWASP site and be more familiarized myself with what they've got there. We also have a list, just a quick article I pulled from CISA about the top routinely exploited vulnerabilities from 2021. And quite honestly, I was just like, meh. I don't think there's anything interesting in here, but it seemed like since CISA posted it, it was a list. We probably should just include it in the show notes. But it boils down to, are you exposed to Log4j? Are you running Exchange? Or are you running a VPN? If so, you probably had a bad 2021. And if not,
or a
you
printer.
had a bad 2021. Yeah, thank you, or a printer. Nothing from NPM made this list, even though we did cover a lot of NPM.
Isn't that
and
surprising?
honestly, there's many other there's a lot of other aspects here. But hey, there was a path traversal on the list, so I figured I'd mention it. But I think that's enough breath of mine that I think I wanted to spend on this one and jump to more interesting articles.
Briefly, one or two things, if I can stick my nose in there. It was a bit of a flashback for me. I mean, like when you look at the second table they've got in there, like the Celion and the sudo issue and the SonicWall and the Pulse Secure, man, I know we talk about this a lot as a world, but like 2021 seems like so long ago and seems like it was so long, and like that just... You could have easily told me the Pulse Secure issue was 5 years ago, and I would have believed you. And that was like about a year ago, I think, right now. Yeah, that's all. The NPM one, I think that's actually really interesting. I hadn't thought about that when I looked at it. And now I'm going to go and look closer, but that's really surprising. I mean, I think they must be focused on packages more so than they are in modules, I think is what's going on there. So they might have to do a second list. But
Yeah, and these are the types of lists just to reinforce or say, we do need to invest in dealing with some of the legacy systems, areas that we haven't paid attention to perhaps in the past, or just say, why are we running our own exchange? Maybe we should outsource that or use a SaaS type of solution. But shifting to something more application defensive related, or for example, a call to change for developers, interesting plans out of Chrome to deprecate document.domain. This is pretty cool, I think, because they're basically saying document.domain, it's been mostly a way to relax, unfortunately, the same origin policy. There's a few design patterns that have emerged from front-end applications that are relying on document.domain. But in the modern world of web application design, we've got better APIs to accommodate these types of design needs or programming needs. And so Chrome is basically saying, we're going to kill document.domain. And by the way, we're going to explain why, and we're going to give you some alternative APIs for how to use post message, how to use channel messaging APIs to basically do the same types of to take advantage of the same types of workflows that you needed. So I think all told, this is a very positive thing because it says why it's a problem, what we're going to do about it, what you'll need to do about it, and it gives, rather than saying this is happening next week, they've got a nice long runway for you to be able to go and change your applications to accommodate it. So it will be a fingers crossed just to see how much traction this gets and how many applications actually change themselves, and if hopefully Safari, Firefox also follow along, which at the end of the Chrome blog, it does link to what the others are considering disabling this, or WebKit is moderatively positive about deprecating the document.domain. So I also just would love that not very concrete or committed language, but let's be moderately positive about our application security, John. That's my takeaway.
I thought it was really, I think what was interesting about this to me is the maturity which we're seeing in not so much as AppSec, but specifically in the I don't say browser companies, browsers. There's a better word there, but like in these products which we have, well, particularly, obviously, I think I'd say numero uno would be Chrome, and Firefox does a good job of this too. It seems like we've hit a point of maturity where they are able to, with confidence, say, we've had enough of this, and we're now going to deprecate it. And we're giving you, like you said, some crazy period of time, which isn't necessary because it sounds like this isn't really heavily used. But just the fact that you're able to sort of go, with confidence, because I think in a previous, few years ago, we would have been like, shoot, that's like, a core part of your DOM. How can you do anything? You're not going to be able to fix that, right? It's like everyone's using it. But now we've done it a few times now, and there's been the bumps in the night, and people sort of figure out how to do it, that they're able to say, yeah, no, we've had enough of that. And I think that's pretty great. And that's I think that's probably a heavier statement than it sounds like if you think about it. If we were to do that within our own companies, even me with a fairly young code base, if I go to deprecate something which is fairly core, I can do it, and I do it, but at the same time, it's like it's how do you do that in a larger code base or in like something as popular and public as this? You have to. It's not easily as done as it sounds like. So I think kudos on that from that point of view.
So I'm also now going to bring in another article not from a security newsletter, but from PyCon. So Python had a conference over the weekend, and there was a really interesting and curious presentation on what is it called? PyScript. So this is basically a way to embed Python within HTML, and that turns into a front-end web page of WebAssembly. So it's a Python to WebAssembly compilation pipeline that is pretty interesting for a couple of reasons. To me, one of the aspects is, where are the security panels, the security presentations at these developer conferences? So this is more of a kind of a call out to our listener population that, yes, there are plenty of B-sides, there's plenty of great security conferences to attend to, and there are good reasons to present at them. But if you want to make a lot of changes, and especially if you have a language-specific type of presentation or topic to cover, go find one of the developer conferences and speak at something like a Python conference, or pick your other favorite language. They've all got them, because that's really the crowd that you want to talk to. So that's one little sandbox aside. But the other thing here is really neat to see a use of WebAssembly that is this is a data science perspective that the company behind this is creating this for, built on a lot of open source capabilities, and script in this other pyodide Python package that I wasn't familiar with. But it's interesting. It will be interesting just to see what developers want to do and the capabilities they're pulling into the browser to start where we'll start seeing WebAssembly. And on the one hand, it's good that it's sandbox. It's good that we've got it to be able. It's neat to see it compiled down into WebAssembly. But it will be interesting to see what types of attacks emerge from that. Meaning, are we less about there's going to be, there may still be sandbox escapes, where my mind is more going is just how much data are we going to start pushing into the front end, or how much data are we going to start moving around between systems? And that's where user identity, service to service identity, like we saw in the Postgres example, becomes really important. So I don't think there's a problem necessarily directly with this. It's a little bit of a, that's interesting, just to put your Python right into your HTML, but something to watch out for, something to keep an eye on for sure.
It is interesting. So we were talking again last few weeks about the costs, both time and resource wise, of moving data around. So you got an interesting point there to think about. I'm guessing they're going to be doing smaller testing in the browser than when they want to do the heavy crunch and to send it to something a little more powerful, but I don't know, maybe not. You've got systems now like this, the new Mac Studio, that like you got crazy performance locally, right? So do you need to use the cloud for doing your training and testing of your algorithms? Maybe not. I have to say that the first thing that really hit me in this article, I was cringing a little bit because I saw this. I'm like, oh no, please don't be compiling to JavaScript. Please don't be compiling to JavaScript. And I hadn't actually figured out yet. I either the word did miss me when I was reading through it. I guess there it is, like halfway down. But then when you said WASM, that somehow has a more positive connotation to me. I'm like, oh, WASM, okay, that's interesting. But I think what you said is accurate in that over the next 24 months or so, as WASM starts becoming more popular, I bet we're going to start seeing some class of security issue with that. We're starting to see some cracks, tiny bit of cracks in some of the Rust stuff. So I suspect we're going to start seeing it here too. And people, it's basically, you go rest on the laurels. I mean, like they say here, it stands on the shoulder of giants, sits on the shoulder of giants. But like, that's not always a good thing, right? It's you still needs to check your regexes and do all these other things. And there's something else we have in here. Oh yeah, something caught my eye, the Thinkscape part about defensive coding. And like, you still have to do these things. So it'll be interesting to see how this affects that. My sense is it's becoming easy enough to do this now to compiling to WASM that we're going to see more folks doing this with different things out there. Can you use it in different scripting connotations, or how it will be used? It's one of those things, like as it's out there, people start playing with it, we'll see how it gets used. So that's going to be sort of neat. Yeah, anyways.
Yeah, and so listeners, if you have some favorite WebAssembly resources, let us know. Or if you've done even some research yourself, or you've come across some research, please highlight it for us. Because one other thing that comes to my mind is just things to worry about are secrets management, and how will we just get into some obfuscated approaches to putting keys, for example, into these identity as we get more and more front-end facing, or I think it's called edge computing is the current term of art for this types of applications. How is WebAssembly handling secrets? Because secrets are what we use and what we need for encryption, for identity, things like that. So I think lots of really neat stuff to research, and a lot of really neat things that could be fruitful for presentations. Another thing that's fruitful for presentations, at least I'm trying to make it happen, is fuzzing. So just a quick reference to this, another article on improving the state of GoFuzz. It's a neat walkthrough that just gives a little bit of background on the Go fuzzer itself, and some feedback on how to make fuzzing more effective against the types of applications that people write. Because it's one thing just to say, yes, we're going to fuzz all of our systems. It's another thing to say, the fuzzer actually understands something like SQL. It understands HTTP 1, HTTP 2, HTTP 3 now, for that matter, and is able to do more interesting types of mucking about with the state machine to find vulnerabilities. And that's really why we need the fuzzing, is to understand the applications rather than just to say we're going to burn a whole bunch of CPU time and hope that we find some vaults. So I want to highlight that real quick, but nothing too a good read, but I didn't want to spend too much time on that because you did allude to a Thinkst article there, John, that I wanted to get to. So let's go to that one. There is another neat quarterly write-up from, or quarterly summary that Thinkst Canary, the Thinkst that they put together, called their Thinkscape. That's really just look back at the quarter of what were the various security presentations that were presented across the spectrum of application security, hardware, and just general InfoSec. There's one really neat one that stood out to me about secure coding and the benefits of it, but I'll say I've been talking for a bit. John, were there certain ones that you had a chance to at least get some interesting that looked interesting from the titles that you wanted to touch on real quick? Yeah,
I wish I'd made some notes on this. So let's see. I'm going to go from the bottom up. And the first one actually I just happened to catch. This is what I was just talking about. So Synology was at a Pwned conference. Is this the big Chinese one? I think it is in 2021. And they didn't get pwned. And the reason why, what this particular article goes through, is like how they've actually gone through and done a bunch of defensive coding in the development of that application. And why that is of particular interest is a Synology device is basically an IoT thing, right? It is sort of, I mean, it's heavier than that. I know they're in data centers, but it's a fairly lightweight NAS. So being able to have that level of AppSec focus on a tool like that, or an application like that, or a package like that, is it's a great sign of maturity. So I thought that was pretty cool. Let me see if I can pick out one or two more. Some of the ML stuff was interesting. Adversarial watermarking to minimize deepfaking. We've already talked about post-quantum cryptography, so I'll skip on that. The confidential computing is okay. didn't really excite me too much. I think that's sort of it's a complicated space. The Hyper-V fuzzer I thought was interesting. From not so much fuzzing Hyper-V, but the devices around it. So, we were just talking about fuzzing the other article, but now how do you, how you do that on a larger scale? Not so much an application, but like think about if you're trying to figure out, weaknesses in KVM and Zen and things like this. And we're always making jokes about the floppy driver, and that's where the bug's going to be, or the USB driver in your VM. So they're doing a spin on that for Hyper-V. I thought that was interesting. How about you? Anything catch your eye?
Yeah, the Synology one was actually the big one that stood out to me, because I also like the spirit of the presentation in the sense that it is talking about, it has some good feedback about what was working from the defensive perspective. And one of the points they're making that adding new features doesn't necessarily have to expand your attack surface, because that attack surface is sort of that magic phrase that the attacker-minded thinking are looking for. When we had that callback, we'll have a callback to the extra replica, the Wiz.io folks looking at where's the attack surface that's out there. And we have one other last article too from Microsoft about Nimbus Pwn that was, again, just what is the attack surface about the IPC message bus within Linux. So that was really neat to me, that it was giving some positive feedback. And I'd also encourage anyone to click through on that, the slides for that, because the two researchers behind it have some great resources on just fuzzing in general and how they go and look for, and I try to identify vulnerabilities. So if you're interested in reverse engineering in this type of research, they have some great resources. So there's definitely a good path to follow down just from that single one. And so that's why for me, I wanted to highlight the Synology one.
And the one other I'd feel remiss if I didn't mention was the AMD branch mispredictor, where no CPU has gone before. If nothing else, just for the title is sort of amazing, right? But it is sort of interesting. And, again, these are sort of those the more meaty, heavier kernel hacking type things, but there's a few good ones in here. I mean, this is always a fun list when they come out with this. I don't think I ever got through all the articles from the last quarterly, and I'll have to try harder with this one to actually not just read the summary, but go through them in depth. So that'll keep me busy for a while.
Keep you busy, yes. And definitely attacking JavaScript engines is another one that's near and dear to my heart. That's possibly on a good topic here for our AppSec folks. And I did mention, I want to just squeeze in a real quick chat about the Nimbus Pwn vulnerability. I don't know that this is a vulnerability or a handful of vulnerabilities that Microsoft discovered within Linux's dbus. Don't know necessarily that it's going to be a super pervasive, all hands on deck type of vuln to go fix, because I'm going to guess that the local privilege escalation might be a dime a dozen, or maybe with a dime every 20, depending on the inflation, but still relatively common. But did want to highlight this because it shows a really neat attacker mindset, in the sense of they were doing some code review, some dynamic testing of dbus, because they're like, oh, look, here is a system passes around messages between a bunch of applications, a bunch of programs, that some of which run as root. And obviously, if it runs as root, that's a good target for us. So they basically said, how can we get ourselves to execute with root privileges? And they went through some fun directory traversal, did appear in here, some race conditions, time of check, time of use, where they swapped out some symlinks, and eventually we were able to execute a program of their own and be able to launch essentially a shell as root. So really neat walkthrough. If you also are unfamiliar with or less familiar with a lot of kernel basics, this is also just a great way to walk through and touch on a lot of common kernel or Linux principles, from directories handling to symlinks to race conditions to shell execution, sbin, bin directories. So it's also a really good kind of educational article, I think. So that's the other reason I wanted to highlight it. But I've exhausted, I think, what I find, what I was wanted to describe there. So anything left over for you, John, to extract from that article, or something else that we might not have touched on?
Oh, I knew when I saw this one last week, and I saw ... I'm like, oh, Mike's going to cover this. Not really. I think some of the diagrams are interesting to actually show visually for those of us like what's actually going on something like this. I think as you said at the top, it's another, at least to me, it's another time of use type vulnerability. I think it's going to be interesting to see. So what distro was this on? Don't know if it mentions. So and where I want to go with this is as some of the Linux distributors are working on new and funky things like both like how does Linux work in a container or in Kubernetes or in a virtual machine, or how do we do modernized package managing? In particular, I'm thinking of Ubuntu Snap. Where you're going to see dbus is still there, but there's other things which are doing fairly powerful, weird stuff in the system. So I think we're going to start seeing some interesting things from other angles. Because there's no doubt in my mind that those things are not 100% secure. They're too new and too complex. So there's something there. This is interesting. I mean, dbus has been around for a while, right? So why hasn't someone poked at this a little bit sooner? Maybe they haven't. They just didn't have the right combination of folks or meals or whatever to actually figure out stuff. But yeah, it's a decent write-up. It's, sort of, I think between, if you bookend what we started and finished with here, if we're finishing with this, starting with the Wiz research, and sort of going through how they did their stuff and their thought process about what they were doing, and then here with the Microsoft Defender guys, what they're doing at the end. I think that gives folks some pretty good homework to sort of think about what they're doing, how you would go through that. And this one, I think I looked last week. The patches are out everywhere, right? There must be. They wouldn't publish otherwise.
So. Yeah, and I think one of them was like he was talking about Linux Mint or some of the less common,
you're right.
I think we'll say about some of the distros. So that's why, the focus for me was more about the approach and the thought process rather than the impact, if you will.
Yeah. But anyways, the reason I was mentioning that is go and find yourself a vulnerable system or create a vulnerable container or VM or what have you, and poke and hack at it and see if you can reproduce what they're doing here, and that's hell, even for me that's sometimes fun. So that's I'll let people go with that.
Yep, set up in your lab. And it also was one of those race conditions that looked actually pretty easy to trigger. I think they only needed 3, less than 10 iterations runs in order to get that race condition to pop correctly, which is good and makes it a lot easier from an educational perspective, a learning perspective, as opposed to other race conditions where you might have to just peg that CPU, sit back for an hour until you get the magic, PID mismatch or PID pop over, something like that. Anyway, those were not PID popover is by no means a technical term. It's just something that I made up, but it sounds delicious. And with that, I think it sounds like we probably better wrap up here before I start making up more application security terms. So let me just say thank you to everyone out there who's listening. Thank you to everybody who was hanging out on Discord with us. Thank you, of course, to John for walking us through a lot of these articles. And please subscribe, give us a like, check out the show notes. And speaking of robots, check out Robot Lover by Vandal Moon. And with that, we'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.